webinar, The Gartner 5-Phase Approach for Enterprise Architecture Leaders to Master AI. This presentation will provide actionable objective insights, expert guidance, and solutions that enable faster, smarter decisions and strong performance on your most critical priorities. I'm Ankit, your host for this session. Before we get started, I have a few tips to help enhance your webinar experience. Around the video player, you will find a variety of ways to interact with the session. We encourage you to participate by clicking Ask the Speaker box to submit your questions and thoughts throughout this program. You can either submit a question anonymously, or if you choose, your name, title, and company can be visible along with your questions. To download a copy of the presentation slides and other helpful resources, just navigate to the bottom of the page. Throughout the program, you can rate this session and share feedbacks on the insight provided. To submit your rating, click Rate Session below the player. A box will open for you to select 1 to 5 hertz. Please note that 5 hertz is the top rating. Share your feedbacks on the insight provided in the Leave Further Feedback box and click Send. This webinar is being recorded. You can watch this presentation again and find more great insights on demand at gartner.com/webinar. Now, I would like to welcome Gartner's Senior Principal Analyst, Lucas Cobart. Lucas, thanks for joining us. Now, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And thanks for everybody who today. Pleasure to have everybody here. We're going to be talking about the Gartner 5-phase approach for enterprise architecture leaders to master AI. I'll be the one presenting the material today, Lucas from Gartner Architecture and Technology Innovation. So without further ado, let's get started. Note from Gartner's legal team. I'll leave this on the screen for a brief moment, but I don't think we plan on forming any cartels here today, so we should be good to go. Let's get to our agenda, shall we? And the agenda for today is fairly simple. We're going to spend our time answering two key questions. The first question is, what is Gartner's 5-phase model to master and apply AI? And the second question we'll be looking to answer is, how can we apply that 5-phase approach to enable AI success in our organization? We'll wrap up with a few key points and then open the floor for questions and answers. And we hope to be able to get to as many questions as we possibly can. So let's start with the first question itself. What is Gartner's 5-phase approach to master and apply AI? And why did we develop it? Well, before we get there, before we answer that question specifically, I just want to quickly take a look at what has brought us here today and why this is such an important question to answer. AI is transforming the relationship between humans and machines. In fact, Gartner predicts that by 2025, generative AI will be a workforce partner for 90% of companies globally. And secondly, by 2030, 80% of humans will engage with smart robots on a daily basis. AI in general will soon infuse everything we do. It will transform our jobs and our organizations. We shape AI, and AI shapes us. We know that despite economic headwinds, AI investment is growing, fueled by generative AI hype and advancements. Executive leaders are prioritizing revenue growth and customer experience over cost savings and will push for relatively quick time to production when it comes to AI investment. In fact, when we asked in a previous webinar titled Beyond the Hype, Enterprise Impact of ChatGPT and Generative AI, how their organization's AI investment strategy has changed since the release of ChatGPT, 45% of executives reported that their investment had increased. We also know, and it's no surprise, that hype surrounding AI related technologies, specifically generative AI, has reached the peak of the Gartner hype cycle. And this is due in large part to popularity of tools like Stable Diffusion, Midjourney, and obviously ChatGPT and other large language models as well. End user organizations in most industries are aggressively experimenting, and numerous startups have emerged in 2023 to innovate with these types of tools and technologies. We expect this to grow. Some governments are already evaluating the impacts of these types of technologies and even preparing to introduce regulations. So the message is clear. EA leaders must enable a structured and business outcome driven approach to AI investment. And that leads us to Gartner's 5 phase AI approach, which is structured and, you guessed it, business outcome driven. This is exactly why we recently published this 5 phase approach for EA leaders to master and apply AI. Enterprise architecture leaders dedicated to helping their organizations successfully derive value from AI investment should follow this 5 phase approach to design for, invest in, and integrate game changing AI capabilities. Let's take a look at each of these phases in turn. This brings us to phase one. Ensure AI initiatives are aligned to targeted business outcomes through a business capability based planning approach. This is so critical. If we do not begin with an outcome in mind, we're going to end up with a sprawl of tools and AI related technologies that are not targeted to accomplishing and delivering the type of value that our organization seeks. And that brings us to phase two, where we need to determine if information architecture practices are currently mature enough to support the aggregation of data and other necessary resources to make AI models work effectively. Moving to phase three, this is all about how we support stakeholders with design thinking best practices or even workshops to select an AI model that is fit for purpose when considering the initiative at hand. Phase four, coordinating with data and analytics and software and engineering leaders to ensure training and testing practices are in place for successful AI model deployment at scale. And then finally, phase five, bringing it all together, defining triggers for architecturally significant model drift that would require revisiting the deployment phase and maybe even backing up another step as well. And so these 5 phases together is what we define as Gartner's 5 phase AI approach. Now that we're familiar with the model and each of the phases, I think it's important that we look at how we can take each of these phases and apply them so that we can, as EA leaders, enable AI success in our organization and how we can use this to derive value from AI investment. So again, right, there's no place to start other than the beginning. So we'll begin with phase one, which is the business case. Remember, phase one is about ensuring AI initiatives are aligned to targeted business outcomes through a business capability based planning approach. And when we talk about outcomes, it's important to distinguish exactly what we mean. Most people talk about strategy. What is our business strategy? And that's important to note, right? And the thing about strategy is that it's where we start, but it's not where we end. If we have a well defined strategy, it's going to quickly translate into specific types of business outcomes, which are not the same, but they need each other. Business outcomes target a specific business result, therefore, a specific business ambition. And they are often long term in nature, 3 to 5 years. But it's important to also have intermediate outcomes in mind, which help us track the achievement of those long term outcomes over time. So AI investment must be tethered to outcomes. Otherwise, all of our focus on AI investment and various use cases are not going to derive the right type of value. So to unpack the business outcomes, we actually have to cascade to supporting and enabling business capabilities. What I have here on the screen is actually a case study example that we profiled from Medtronic a couple of years ago, which is their approach to how they cascade from those targeted specific business outcomes to the enabling and supporting business capabilities. This is so critically important because oftentimes I hear as an analyst here at Gartner that it's difficult to actually translate these high level outcomes into specific initiatives and types of investment to achieve those outcomes. It's a gray area and it's hard to connect the dots. Business capabilities serve as an intermediary where we can actually see the types of critical activities an organization must execute to realize their outcomes. And so once we have a good sense of the exact type of business capabilities that are going to enable a specific outcome, then we can start to work with those capabilities and understand whether or not they are ready for AI investment. That's what this slide is all about. Understanding the specific types of capabilities that are tied to an outcome, and then as EA leaders, recommending AI investment based on readiness, AI readiness within a particular capability. And AI readiness is not just specifically about technology. In fact, it's much broader than that. When we look at a business capability, we have to look at the four core capability dimensions. We have to look at people, we have to look at process, we have to look at information and data, and then, of course, technology. And so, across these four core dimensions, we can determine AI readiness by looking at potential criteria. Things like the benefit to cost opportunity for the business capability potentially being assessed as high readiness, or the associated resources have been assessed as mature, efficient, or optimal, or leadership, governance, and funding are uniquely aligned to support a specific type of AI initiative, or risks to business and technology assets are low or manageable, right? These are the types of criteria that we would be looking for across these dimensions to assess whether or not AI investment is warranted in a particular capability that's going to enable a targeted outcome. And that brings us to phase two. Once we've identified the business case, once we know what our targeted outcome is, and we know which capabilities are going to support that outcome, and then we know further which capabilities are most ready for AI investment, experimentation, and scaling, we then need to move to the second phase, which is all about determining if information architecture practices are currently mature enough to support the aggregation of data and other resources necessary to make AI models work. In short, we at Gartner call this phase data discovery. And I want to take a moment to just talk about data in general, because this is a question that we get asked so often when it comes to AI investments. What type of data do we need? How much of it do we need? And what should it look like? What is the quality level necessary to actually be able to make use of some of these AI investments that we're targeting? And so at Gartner, we talk about data usability, and data must be usable to derive AI value. We define usability here at Gartner as the ability of a user to derive insights from data to achieve business outcomes. And usability is also defined by three specific components. The first is relevance, which means users can address their business needs with data. The second is accessibility. Users can obtain the data that they need when they need it. And actionability is our third component here, meaning users can translate data into action-oriented decisions. And so it's our job, right, as EA leaders and the architects that work on our teams or across our disciplines, or maybe are federated in different parts of the organization, we must harness all of our expertise around architecture best practices to help reveal data needs for AI investment. What I have here on the screen is a case study that we recently published with Globo on their practice for doing exactly this, revealing data needs for different types of investment. The example here on the screen is not specific to AI, but can easily be applied to an AI initiative. As we see here, it all starts with a conversation. By clarifying what users are trying to do with data as we see in the figure on the screen, information architects can use this insight to build information services that meet users' diverse needs while also driving reusability for shared needs. And as we see in the conversation that's being had on this page, steps 2 through 4 ensure data relevance, accessibility, and actionability. The questions asked in these engagements reveal exactly the types of data that are needed, where we can find them, how we can obtain them, and how we can actually act upon them to get to specific achievable business outcomes that we can realize using the data that we have or that we can acquire. And that moves me to my next point. Oftentimes, we might not have the data that we're looking for. After all, we're in the data discovery phase of the 5 phase approach. And in this phase, if we can't source the data internally, there's a couple of approaches that we can take. The first would be to synthetically augment data needs. And I'm bringing in another case study example here that we recently did with Fidelity International. So as we're showing on the screen, Fidelity takes an approach to synthetically augment data needs. Look at the table below the orange chevron on that page. There's various data capabilities that can be supported by a synthetic approach. Volume, noise, balance, shareability. All of these receive benefits from generation of synthetic data. If you don't have the ability to generate synthetic data today, potentially think about scheduling an inquiry with us here at Gartner, where we can talk about best practices to approach this specific capability. Oftentimes, right, we might need to then, if we can't synthetically generate or don't have internal data that would be usable, we can look externally, and that's an approach that we need to consider as well. Here on this slide, I'm just providing some simple examples of data needs across different types of generative AI usage. The first one on the far left shows an example where we might prompt an already existent generative AI application, right? And so the data needs here might just be prompt templates or examples that we aggregate internally. And EA leaders might be responsible for this effort as we already have expertise in building various types of repositories in the first place: application repositories, pattern repositories and libraries, architecture accelerators. Prompt templates seem no different. The second example is where we're fine tuning a foundational model or an API. And this is where we would need to add our own data or logic. And oftentimes there are security concerns here. So we might potentially think about the external publicly available data that might answer our needs, or if we could synthetically augment our existing needs or existing data internally. And then finally, on the far right-hand side of the screen, we see the example of where we are actually customizing and developing our own use cases or applications. And this is where we're adding our own data and following customization instructions. And so in this specific example, this is where the data that we can source or the data that we have or the data that we can acquire becomes ever more critical. And determining the right type of application or right type of deployment of a technology like generative AI would again be based on the outcome that we're trying to pursue and defined in phase one. And this moves us to phase three. Remember, phase three is about supporting stakeholders with design thinking best practices or workshops to select an AI model that is fit for purpose when considering the initiative at hand. So in phase one, we defined our outcome. In phase two, we identified the data that would help us accomplish or achieve or realize that outcome. In phase three, we're now putting those two things together, the outcome and the data available or the data constraints that we may face, to select a model that is fit for purpose and is going to help us realize the outcome that we started with. So let's take a second to talk about that, right? Targeted outcomes plus data constraints equals AI model selection. It's the combination of these two things, the targeted outcome we want to achieve and the data constraints that we face, that help us select the most appropriate AI model. But we might be thinking at this point, what are the possible AI models that we could select? And how, as EA leaders, would we actually go about recommending these types of models based on the targeted outcomes that were identified and the data constraints that we face? And so it's important to, again, have an outcome driven approach when we are selecting these types of models. And if we look at this here, this outcome driven model selection guidance, this is actually a table that we published in our notes supporting Gartner's 5 phase approach to master and apply AI. And it's important to take this table column by column. And I know it's a wall of text, but let's just take a couple of minutes to break this down. When we think about the characteristics of the outcome that we're trying to achieve, we actually need to think about the way in which we're asking an AI model to ultimately think. And so when we think about the outcomes that we have to determine, are they philosophical and or psychological paradigms for human cognition? Is this associated, or is this a characteristic of the outcome that we're trying to achieve? Or is the outcome that we're trying to achieve just really a representation of knowledge or some sort of ability to create sensory models or sensory interfaces, touch, smell, feel? Uh, or are we trying to create something that can enable other devices or itself move autonomously? Or are we just simply maybe trying to automate our processes to increase productivity? Or finally, we might be trying to actually increase our productivity exponentially and change the game when it comes to the way that work gets done within our organization by deploying some sort of intelligent agent that can orchestrate various processes simultaneously. And so, based on the type of outcome that we have and the characteristics of that outcome itself, that's going to go in large part to determining the type of AI mechanism and AI tool and ultimately AI model that's out there as far as what is possible and what we should select at the end of the day. But again, the other half of the equation would be those data characteristics, right? And so is the data, or should the data, or can the data be represented by natural language? Or, can the data be represented mostly by natural language, but we are going to need some perceptory data as well, vision? Or, the representation of data, it needs to be both perceptory and sensory. Or the data itself needs to be represented through combination of sensory and electromechanical, right? The data characteristics of what we have and what we need is the second half of that equation to determining the type of model that we'll ultimately deploy. And so, as you can see in the table here, the first two columns, the characteristics of the outcome and the characteristics of the data that we have or can source, or maybe the constraints of what we don't have, will then determine the common AI mechanisms that we might think about deploying. And so that could be anything from probabilistic reasoning, which I think most would be familiar with under names like machine learning and deep learning, because the common AI tool that we would typically deploy based on that need or that mechanism of probabilistic reasoning would be something like generative AI. And this has been talked about ad nauseum in media and within organizations and around boardrooms. So this is becoming a more familiar concept. But that's not where AI starts and stops. In fact, it's much broader. Common AI mechanisms might also include, based on the outcome and data characteristics, computational logic and knowledge representation, where in fact we might deploy some sort of decision support system, or smart robotics, where we might deploy various types of robots or autonomous devices and vehicles, or even something around an optimization technique where we might have AI driven robotic process automation, something that's been around for a while. And ultimately, right, if we have the need for a mechanism that can optimize techniques and allow for agent based computing, we actually might need a combination of everything that's been listed above. So it's our job as EA leaders to take this hyped and buzzworthy term, artificial intelligence, and actually break it down into specific things and pragmatic steps so that our business partners can determine this is the type of model that we're going to use, and this is the types of outcomes that we're going to achieve with it. So once we've taken a look at this outcome driven model selection guidance, the other thing that I wanted to point out is that organizations are already doing this and actually moving beyond just having the EA team or the EA leader as the sole source of expertise when it comes to deploying models. In fact, right, and what I'm sharing on the screen is a case study that we recently profiled last year from Fidelity Investments. We have to set our data scientists free, whether those be data scientists by name and title, or data scientists in the form of citizen developer or business technologist who have the skills and expertise and commitment as a process of exploration and discovery. At Fidelity, data scientists go back and forth between data sets, features, models, and business problems. A change to one element affects others, and in turn, this can affect which model is being used and the business question being answered. So, due to these types of ripple effects, data scientists at Fidelity need a level of freedom over process and tooling at the model creation and fine tuning stage. On the screen, as I was mentioning before, we see how Fidelity specifically does this. And so some of the things that they do is provide ready access to production data, ready access to curated data sets, ample opportunity to get feedback from business domain experts, no restrictions on tools, platforms, or packages of processes used, and data engineers to support custom data requests and build custom pipelines. And this is all done within a sandboxed environment where these types of folks, again, whether being named data scientists or business technologists, can imagine and create models the way they see fit. So if this is already happening within certain organizations where this has moved beyond some sort of stage gated process where EA leaders can fit these types of initiatives into a neat cookie cutter process, we need to be thinking fast about what is the guidance? What are the guardrails that we put in place, as Fidelity has done here, to enable the broad experimentation and deployment of AI models at scale, but also harkening back to everything that we've already talked about? Making sure that we're tying these types of initiatives back to outcomes, making sure that the data that we can find is fit for purpose and drives the type of models that we'll ultimately deploy. We cannot be the only experts in our organization when it comes to AI. We need to scale competency in this emerging technology and scale it fast. And that moves us to our fourth phase of the Gartner 5 phase AI approach. Remember, when it comes to the fourth phase, it's all about coordinating with data and analytics and software and engineering leaders to ensuring training and testing practices are in place for successful AI model deployment. This is really where the rubber meets the road. We've defined our business case. We know what our outcome is. We know the data that we have. Those two things together help us select the right type of model. And now it's time to get it out there so we can start to derive the value and track the benefits and go tell all of our stakeholders the wonderful things that we've done. But we also cannot forget important aspects of deployment. Training and testing must be done in a secure and trustworthy manner in the deployment phase. That's where one of Gartner's top strategic technology trends for 2024 comes into play, which is AI TRISM, or AI Trust, Risk, and Security Management. AI TRISM is a framework of risk and security controls and trust enablers. It helps organizations govern and manage AI models and applications throughout their life cycles and achieve business goals. It's not the only technology trend that we're tracking here at Gartner, but is certainly applicable in most cases, most applicable to what we're talking here today about the 5 phase AI approach and how we in a systematic and business outcome driven way, deploy AI models to realize value from those investments that we're making. If you have questions on any of the other strategic technology trends for 2024, whether they be in the protect your investment category, the rise of the builders, or the deliver the value category, let us know. We'd be happy to have a conversation about these top strategic technology trends with you. And so when we talk about AI TRISM, or trust, risk, and security management, specifically within our AI investments, and as we're deploying our AI models, I want to go back to that case study that we were doing with Fidelity just a moment ago. See here, right? There are a number of different types of controls that we can put in place as we seek to deploy an AI model. And so when it comes to model operations, this is actually a critical TRISM component. If you read the Gartner research that we've published on this top strategic technology trend, you'll see model operations come up quite frequently. And not just for AI models, but for all types of models. Here specifically, we're just referring to AI. And how Fidelity, if you look at some of those operational controls, is able to monitor the volume of requests or rejected requests, or the number of other models connected to the current model, or the latency or availability or artifact maintenance or number of incidents, right? And the impact, if we don't have the ability to put these operational controls in place, could be that our models stop running, or they run but they don't deliver 100% of expected inferences, or the effect execution or performance of downstream apps it degrades, right? So this component of TRISM, executed here by Fidelity in high fashion, is quite important to think about as we deploy the models that we seek to achieve our business outcomes. And I also just want to make the quick note, when we're talking about training and testing during deployment, a final note to make here: testing should cover 4 outcome types. And the 4 outcome types that we're looking at here is the ones that are commonly known to any of us that have spent time working with these types of models, or any type of model, right? Any type of predictive model. We're looking for true positives, false negatives, or true negatives. The ability to capture and analyze these and the different metrics that they allow tracking of are actually going to help us determine whether or not the model that we put into production is delivering the type of value that we hope to produce in the first place. This actually comes from a published note on the Gartner website about overcoming data quality risks when using semi-structured or unstructured data for artificial intelligence or machine learning models. This could be incredibly difficult, or more difficult to do as we use semi-structured or unstructured data. And we would know that in phase 2 when we identify the data that we're actually going to use for our model. So this is something to think about ahead of time once we get to production and we've done our training and we're doing our testing and then we're going to ultimately deploy for wide and broad use. The tracking of these 4 outcome types and how our models are performing against them. So this brings us to the 5th phase of the Gartner 5-phase AI approach. And so when we think about this final phase, it might seem like an add-on or a bolt-on, and it commonly is when we think about various models or frameworks that are out there. When we talk about continuous monitoring, it almost seems like a given. Hey, we're going to do the important steps, and then, oh yeah, we'll continuously monitor how something works, or how something is going down the line. But when it comes to AI investment and AI initiatives, continuous monitoring cannot just be a talking point and cannot be a platitude. The risks inherent in something going wrong, especially as it's operating autonomously, must be continuously monitored and then action taken if we find something that's going wrong. So, in this 5th phase, we talk about defining triggers for architecturally significant model drift that would require revisiting the deployment phase or even phases before it. And so, how would we go about continuously monitoring the deployment of our AI models? For this exact question, I want to turn to a case study that we did with a company, Georgia Pacific, on exactly this, the tracking and monitoring of AI models that have been put into production. The first thing that we would hope to monitor, at least I hope we would, is whether or not an AI model is delivering real and true business value, or at least the business value that we defined in we chose to define it. Right? The business value generated by a combination of model performance, system performance, and business factors. At Georgia Pacific, to prevent AI models from losing business, the EA leader there understands how AI models generate business value in production itself. Oftentimes, most equate model prediction performance to the business value of the model. However, we need to know that predictive performance, as we were talking about on the last slide with those 4 outcome types, is only one of many factors that will ultimately affect the business value generated. At Georgia Pacific, they have a comprehensive framework to understand how AI models generate business value in production. The business value of a model is determined by model prediction performance in production, system performance in production, and a set of value drivers in the business case, which in Gartner's AI 5 phase approach is the very first step. For example, the business value of a customer churn model could be understood by a combination of different things like parameters and values set by the customer churn business case, the model's success in predicting which customers will and won't churn, and latency and downtime of the infrastructure used to obtain the model's predictions. These things in aggregate would help us understand value, but each individually does not do the job alone. So we talked about how phase 5 is all about establishing triggers to actually determine when these things, whether they be metrics or key indicators around the business case performance or the system performance or the model performance itself, right? The combination of these 3 things. How would we put triggers in place that would set alarms for value drift or help us understand that we're not realizing the type of value that we're looking for? Well, at Georgia Pacific, right, they use metric weights and severity of deviation from thresholds to determine drift alarm levels. For example, right, to detect business value dissipation proactively, they've set up a system to quantify drifts and set acceptable thresholds. And actually, there's a team stood up for this, the decision analytics team at Georgia Pacific, and they defined and measured the leading indicators of each drift that led to business value dissipation. They've set up drift tolerance thresholds for each drift metric, and an alarm is triggered for each metric when the value crosses the set thresholds for that metric. Depending on the alarm, the right type of stakeholder is actually notified automatically so that these things can be addressed in real time rather than waiting for some sort of lag or latency in resolving the issue. And so the last thing that I want to talk about here is how, going back to one more time, the fidelity model around deploying AI mechanisms and AI tools is that we make our models observable in production, right? Because how would we actually know or be able to determine when the alarm should be set off? And Fidelity does a good job here of identifying the must have and then the when possible metrics to make our AI models more observable as we push them into production. And so the teaching here or the main takeaway is that Fidelity creates dashboards with metrics that monitor the AI model in 5 dimensions for comprehensive observability. And so these observability dimensions are everything from input quality controls to business value controls to fairness or compliance controls, operational controls, as we mentioned, as is a critical component of AI Trism, and then performance controls, things like comparing the model predicted distribution to actual distribution, and are nice to have when possible, but not the critical must have dimensions as mentioned here. So that moves us to the sort of summarization of everything that we've talked about today. We've gone through the 5 phases. We've talked about what Gartner's 5 phase AI approach means, right, and how we can use it to master and apply AI within our organization. And then we've walked through each of the 5 phases themselves and looked at some best practices on how we would actually take this 5 phase framework and use it as EA leaders within our own companies and our own organizations to be successful in driving value through our AI investments. And so, what have we specifically talked about? Well, we've talked about the five phases. And phase one around the business case, phase two around discovering data, phase three around model selection, phase four around deploying the model, and phase five around continuously monitoring performance and value. And each of these phases serves a purpose, right? Phase one ensures that AI initiatives are aligned to targeted business outcomes through a business capability based planning approach. Phase two helps us determine if information architecture practices and our data in general is currently mature enough to support the aggregation of resources, data included, necessary to make our AI models work. Phase three is how we help support stakeholders with design thinking best practices or even workshops to select an AI model right for them and fit for purpose when considering the initiative at hand. Phase four is how we coordinate with data and analytics and software and engineering leaders to ensure training and testing practices are in place for successful AI model deployment and scaling. And then phase five is how we define triggers for architecturally significant model drift that would require us to revisit the deployment phase or even phases earlier than that. And so, what I want to leave you with today is actually something that we just published just 1 month ago. And this is Gartner's AI use case prism for EA. And so it's important that EA leaders understand how we support stakeholders in their own AI initiatives and AI investments. But we as EA leaders should also, in turn, think about how we can apply AI to the various numbers of activities and responsibilities that we have on an everyday basis. Anything from capability investment optimization or augmented EA governance or enterprise scenario planning or solution architecture generation or enterprise threat and opportunity analytics, right? These are use cases that we have identified and analyzed here at Gartner and have recently been published, as I mentioned, in our use case prism for enterprise architecture. And so this is something that's available. This is something that you can take and go and try and see based on the business value and the feasibility of some of these use cases to determine, hey, could we actually make ground or gain ground in our understanding and application of artificial intelligence within our organization? And could EA maybe even lead the way in that effort? And so this is sort of a call to action for everyone here with us today on how we can take everything that we've learned and go and start to apply this in the real world, even against some of our own daily responsibilities. And with that, we will move to the section where I'll turn it back over to Ankit. If you have any particular questions that you would like to ask us or ask me, please do put them in the chat now. We'll gather all of those questions and in a couple of minutes, a couple of moments, try to answer as many of them as we possibly can. So thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you, Lucas, for sharing your insights. We have time to take some questions now. Please continue to submit your questions and thoughts in the Ask the Speaker box, and remember to rate this session using the link on the top left corner above the player. To submit your rating, click Rate Session below the player. A box will open for you to select 1 to 5 hertz. Please note that 5 hertz is the top rating. Share your feedbacks on the insight provided in the Leave Further feedback box and click Send. Before we get to Q&A, here are some resources to take you deeper into the topics. Learn how to create an effective pathway to create future at Gartner IT Infrastructure Operations and Cloud Strategy Conference. Visit the link on the slide to learn more. Additionally, we would like to invite you to download your roadmap guide, The Modernization of Digital Technology Foundations, Drive Growth by Aligned Business and Technology Strategies. Want to stay in the know? Connect with us on LinkedIn, X, formerly known as Twitter, and sign up to our bi weekly newsletter to receive the latest Gartner IT insights and updates across the research, conference, and more. It's all curated specially for IT leaders and decision makers. If you want to learn more on how Gartner can help you achieve your mission critical priorities, contact us via the methods on this slide. You can download these resources from the bottom of the page. Plus, you can find more great insight Access the presentation slides and see upcoming and on-demand webinars at gartner.com/webinars. Okay, Lucas, over to you to address the questions.
Thank you, Ankit. So there are a number of questions that have been provided here, and I absolutely love that. We're going to try to get through as many of these questions as we possibly can in the last 10 to 12 minutes that we have here. I'm going to focus on this question first because I believe, received the most number of upvotes, as Ankit was telling me. And so this question was, what's the enterprise architecture's value proposition back to the organization related to providing AI services? In other words, why engage EA as opposed to engaging an AI team, or maybe the data and analytics function that has been doing a lot of work with AI in the first place? And so there's a couple of answers to this question. And I'll start with the first one, right? The first one is, in a lot of organizations, there's nobody dedicated to AI today, right? It's the well understood that we should be experimenting and trying to leverage this emerging technology, but it's being done in sort of a haphazard or federated approach, and there's really no team or group driving how we think about this at an enterprise level. And that is one of the comparative advantages that an enterprise architecture team typically has within your common organization, is that they are the group that can look across everybody and everything going on within the organization and say, what is going to be scalable? What is going to help us move from our current state to our future state? And what is the enterprise level roadmap that we need to get us there? Right. And so if we have been already doing a good job of executing against our current value proposition, whatever that may be, whether it's helping to enable digital transformation, or optimize costs, or whatever sort of outcome or priority within your enterprise that you've grabbed onto and said this is the value that EA helps deliver, then moving to this as a next step is pretty feasible and understandable. Which is, how do we think about AI globally within our organization, and how do we determine the right places to invest so that we can help realize these target state outcomes that we have? Capability based planning, helping to develop the IT strategy, these are all common responsibilities of an EA group. And so if your EA group does not understand AI or how it fits into your organization strategy, then getting close to you're getting close to missing the boat when it comes to helping your organization capture the benefits that this emerging technology can realize. So that would be my first answer to the question. My second answer to the question is that we cannot fall into negative EA tendencies, right? And so this is where we need to do some self-reflection to say, hey, there are a lot of benefits for us being involved in the conversation around how we use AI across our organization, but we cannot do it in a siloed effort, and we must be collaborative with other functions and other teams that are going to be important in actually pushing the ball forward. And so these could be teams, as was mentioned in the question, such as, hey, do we have a team dedicated to AI? What are they doing? How can we help them? How can we add value to that stakeholder? Or do we have a data and analytics function that is already proficient in aggregating data and making data more usable? Fantastic. Well, that fits in directly into the 5 phase approach that we talked about today. How do we fill in the other gaps that are not currently being tackled? So let's ask ourselves, number one, does the comparative advantage hold that EA is looking across the organization systematically and globally? And then two, who are the other partners that we can pull in and work with to really drive this effort forward? And that is the reason, or that is the type of value that EA can provide in being involved in these types of AI conversations. So that's my answer to that question, as far as the different ways that you can look at it. So then there was another good question here, going back to phase one, right, about determining the quote unquote readiness of individual business capabilities for AI investment. And I thought this was a really good one. And so the way that I would think about it is, let's not completely rethink the way that we talk about business capability maturity, right? There are, and so the end of the question here is there a standard framework or guideline available? And of course there are, right? There are already standard frameworks out there around how we assess business capability model or business capability specific maturity. And we would look to those four core dimensions of people, process, information, and technology. And those maturity models are typically on a 5-point scale. If you have interest in learning what those capability maturity models or levels look like, we have various examples of them here at Gartner. We'd be happy to share with you. Applying AI to those maturity models or maturity levels would not require much reworking at all. So I would say stay the course, use what works, and specifically for the technology dimension, assess how AI could then mature your capability models even further. Let's look at some of the other questions here. This is just a good one, just to sort of get a pulse on where your peers are. Where are most EA leaders in their journey to enabling the enterprise use of AI? And I would say not very many are very far. Right. This is the beginning for most folks. This is actually why we chose to write the type of guidance that we did in our note around the 5 phase approach for EA leaders to master and apply AI, which is available on the Gartner website. The reason we chose to write that note is we saw a gap in the marketplace around just basic step by step or a structured approach that EA leaders could start to take to actually enable the enterprise use of AI within their organizations. So, in large part, I would say most are at the beginning, but that won't stay that way, and I imagine it won't stay that way for very long. This emerging technology is advancing so rapidly that if as an EA leader, we are not doing something about it now, we will be too late, I would say, by next year. So, what are some of the other questions? I think we have about 4 minutes before we have to turn everything over to wrap up. Um, Here's a good one. Do we feel that the increase in usage of AI, and specifically generative AI, requires an expansion of a generalist role, a generalist architecture role, to specialize in this area for most companies? And I would say we have not seen the broad application or the broad expansion of some sort of AI architect as far as a specific domain architect, such as cloud architects are more common today, but they weren't as common 10 years ago, for example. So there is a potential scenario where, just like cloud architects, we might have specialized domain architects specific to AI. In fact, in the case study that I was sharing from Fidelity Investments, they do have identified AI architects that work on some of the things that was shared on the screen today. But I would say most organizations don't. Most organizations do not have an architect dedicated to AI. And I would imagine that the most plausible scenario is that most organizations never will. And that's just because most EA teams, at least, are fairly small, right? We might have a couple of enterprise architects, maybe a business architect or two, a handful of solution architects, and that really rounds out our team. And so it might fall on one of those types of roles, whether it be an enterprise architect to think about AI governance, or a solution architect to think about AI model implementation and integration, or a business architect to think about capability readiness for AI investment. It might be a collective effort across the EA group as far as who wears that hat and who takes on that responsibility. But that's not to say that we haven't seen it already. We certainly have, as I mentioned with the Fidelity case study. All right, 2 more minutes. Let's see how many questions we can get through. Maybe just one more. Um, Oh, this is a fantastic one, because this goes back to that table that I said was so critical about choosing and selecting an AI model in the first place. So the question that one of your peers submitted is, in the model of potential outcomes, what do you mean with psychological and philosophical human cognition? And so this is not the outcome itself would not be philosophical human cognition, but the characteristic of the type of outcome that we're trying to achieve could be in part, right, philosophical or psychological human cognition. So what do we mean by that? And this goes back to the primitive days of AI research in the 70s and 80s and so on, where we were trying to understand, how do humans actually think? Right? If we're going to have intelligence, quote unquote, that is artificial or trying to mimic human intelligence, how do humans think? And so there's been a ton of research over the decades to break down psychological and philosophical human cognition or human thinking. And so one of our outcomes, as an example, might be that we have a machine as a teammate or a machine as a manager. And so, if that's an outcome that our organization is pursuing to solve talent shortages or to solve productivity problems, right, then that outcome would require or would have a characteristic of saying, how does my teammate or how do people on my team actually get work done? Right? What is the human cognition related to generating an invoice or billing a customer or recruiting an employee? Right. And then as far as a manager goes, right, what is the human cognition or human thinking related to empathy when it comes to giving a performance review or working with HR if there's a performance issue that we have to handle with somebody on our team, right? If we have a machine as a manager, that outcome, developing something like that, would absolutely require psychological and philosophical human cognition as a characteristic of that outcome. So that's exactly what we mean. And as you saw on that table, it was mapped to the types of AI mechanisms like deep learning, which large language models are a type of deep learning, and then the type of tooling or solution that's out there to provide that mechanism would be something like generative AI. And then the furthering on of that type of tooling, maybe like an autonomous agent, right? And that might require usage or combinations of some of the other characteristics that we were showing in that table. But that's exactly the type of thing that we mean and the type of conversation that we have to have with our business partners to figure out what are we really trying to do here, and so what type of model would be most fit for purpose. But with that, I know we only have a couple of minutes left. Ankit, do we need to wrap things up, or do we have time um, for another question?
We can take a few more questions.
Fantastic, fantastic. Let's see. Um, let's see. What other questions do we have? Are there any associated intelligent technologies, such as knowledge graphs, data graphs, ontology, etc., that can be brought to bear for AI and EA? Yeah, and so there are a number of different types of technologies, right, or mechanisms, and some of them were shown in the table itself. Knowledge graphs were included in that table specifically. So there are different types of mechanisms that would fit under the AI umbrella, or specific techniques that we can use when it comes to AI, as far as how they are used in EA, and how EA can help our stakeholders and help our partners figure out what types of mechanisms do we actually need to be using. And so again, not to sound like a broken record, but it really does come back to the outcome that our organization is trying to pursue. And one of the other questions in here is, what's the biggest challenge in pursuing this 5 phase approach to master and apply AI? And I would say it's the first one. I would say it's the first one. And it's because as we talk with clients here at Gartner, one of the things that we do as EA leaders too often is we move to technology as fast as we possibly can without first figuring out what is the thing that we actually want the technology to do with us, right? Or do for us. And so if we can't figure that out, and it's going to require conversations with a broad set of stakeholders, then we're putting ourselves in a bad position. And I think, quite honestly, that might be the reason that we do it, is because it does require a broad conversation with a broad set of stakeholders so that we get to the right type of thing to do in the first place. And so I would say, if we get the business case right, if we get that phase right where we select the right outcome, then everything will sort of fall into place after that. And that would be the biggest challenge I'd see in pursuing something like this. Here's a fun one with just 2 minutes left. What is the likelihood that AI will replace the architect? We haven't made any predictions here at Gartner or strategic planning assumptions specific to architecture roles or architecture jobs, but we have made predictions or strategic planning assumptions related to all types of jobs. Right. And we do actually see, and there's a lot of pessimism out there as you look in the press and industry publications and just general media about AI replacing jobs. What we see is that there's actually a great potential for AI to augment existing and actually create entirely new jobs. And so, especially for a role like an architect, I don't see AI completely replacing that role at all. I do see that there are various ways that AI can augment different architecture roles and even start to do that today. And that's the entire reason why we came up with the AI use case prism for EA. But what that does is, number one, it frees up our time to actually maybe have some of those conversations that we need to be having more of to figure out what in the world we actually should be doing. And then number two, frees up more time to work on things beyond the current scope of the architecture practice or architecture discipline within our organization. Because oftentimes, right, EA teams are small, as I said before. And so if AI can augment some of the mundane or repeatable things as just a nascent use case today, what could that have as a potential impact for you to scale and influence the rest of the organization as the EA group? So with that, Ankit, I know we are at the top of the hour, so I will pause here and let us wrap up. But I do just want to thank everybody for joining today and for the opportunity to answer some of your questions. So thank you.
Thank you, Lucas. Before you go, just a quick reminder, you can download the presentation slides and other resources from the bottom of the page. Please rate this session and share your feedbacks on the insight provided. To submit your rating, click the rate session below the player. A box will open for you to select 1 to 5 hertz. Please note that 5 hertz is the top rating. Share your feedbacks on the insight provided in the leave for the feedback box and click send. All right, with that, I'd like to again thank our presenters and, of course, thank you for joining us. Have a great day. Goodbye.